Now, the topic is why liberal democracy is necessary for Indian development. And so immediately you must ask, who am I to speak on all this? I certainly am not a political scientist. Some would say I'm not even an economist. But I have the benefit of seeing political economy play out, both in policy making in India and across the world. And I think as an observer, I have some experience to talk about what I see going on. And the point I want to make in this talk is there is an argument that democracy holds back growth and development in India, and so what we need is a strong leader and an authoritarian leadership with few checks and balances on it. And certainly India seems to be drifting in this direction, and there are many who applaud it, including people outside India. I believe this argument is totally misguided because it's based on an outdated model of development. And I would argue that instead, India's future will be based on how it can make its liberal democracy and its institutions. And if it can do that, I think its future is limitless. If it doesn't, I think it's much bleaker. Now, I'm going to make this argument based on the economics because I want to make the point that it is in India's self-interest to strengthen rather than weaken liberal democracy. It's not just a concern of Leuten's Delhi that we need democracy. It's a much larger concern. But I don't want to just leave it at self-interest. I want to say, as we start, that if we allow our democracy to crumble into majoritarianism or authoritarianism, it's not just our economic future which is jeopardized, it's our soul as a nation and our place in the community of democratic nations. It's a moral imperative for us to not do it. But let me put the morality aside and talk about the economics, because at least for a lot of people, the economics makes direct sense. India is certainly rebounding today, and we keep saying we're the fastest growing large economy in the world, and that's right. Of course, with bouncing back from a pretty catastrophic pandemic and growth rates which were quite miserable at that time, and of course the war in Ukraine, inflation and rising interest rates, like everywhere else, are casting a shadow. But we also must recognize that the last few years have been quite bad for our poorest citizens, especially our youngest citizens, the children who have suffered during the pandemic and continue to suffer with a K-shaped recovery. I believe the scarring of India's lower middle class households and its small and medium enterprises, we haven't seen the full effects so far, but we will see the effects over time. And that means any rebound will remain somewhat subdued after the initial strong rebound from the lows of the pandemic. So we need to work on this. India's growth cannot be taken for granted. But I also want to emphasize that our slow growth is not all the fault of the pandemic. It is something that has been building up. Our underperformance actually dates from perhaps the global financial crisis and its aftermath. Read the papers. Our biggest problem is we're not creating enough good jobs. You can see with the protests against the Agnipath scheme. What is the Agnipath scheme for those who don't follow the Indian scene closely? The government announced a change in military recruitment. Now, at the entry level, 3/4 of the people will be recruited for 4 years and then given an exit handshake, and the rest will stay on. Now, this seems like something that could make the military much younger and more effective, perhaps less well trained. There's a lot of debate on all that. But what is important is a lot of young people took to the streets on hearing this, simply because government jobs are, in a sense, the last resort, given there are few other jobs available. You've all heard about 12 million applicants in the railways for 35,000 jobs. You see, many students sitting for exam after exam, public service exam, until they superannuate. They become too old to take more exams. and then they have to actually look for a job which is non-government. Now, the worrisome thing about all these people looking for government jobs is not just the fact that jobs are so scarce, but the fact that they're so scarce despite the fact that our biggest minority, women, are not really entering the labor force in a big way. India's female labor force participation is among the lowest in the G20 at 20.3% in 2019. We rivaled Saudi Arabia for how bad it was for women. India's record is very good if you look at the 2 decades after the 1991 reforms. We grew at an average of about 7% a year, which is, with very few exceptions, one of the strongest records in development. Notable successes even in the last decade of relatively slow growth. Well, let me give you one example. The Aadhaar stack, which was conceived by Nandan Nilekani, has created a tremendous number of possible applications, including one that we were involved with at the Reserve Bank of India, the Universal Payment Interface. That started in 2016. Nice thing when you're in charge of the bank is you can take credit for everything. So I'm going to take credit for whatever role we played there. Of course, the National Payment Corporation of India played a much bigger role. But we have 4 billion transactions a month now on UPI. What is UPI? Some of you have used it. Basically, the ability to pay for anything, by just scanning the QR code of the shopkeeper and making a direct transfer from your bank. There are other examples of Indian successes, such as our many unicorns. Our discount price mission to Mars, 72 million, according to one telling, of sending a satellite from India to Mars. Of course, our Thomas Cup team recently won the Thomas Cup, and despite our loss yesterday, I think our cricket team is still pretty good. So, we have successes, but if we dwell only on them and don't assess our failings critically, we increase the chance of underperformance. And so let me ask the question, if India and Indians have so much potential, not more than any other peoples in the world, but we are 1.4 billion people. So why is it that India is faltering? Why aren't we doing better? Why are we failing our youth? And I will argue it's not the fault of our people as much as it is a failure of imagination of our politics and leadership. And I would say that failure is more recent than in the more distant past when we grew very strongly. What worked in those early decades was really a willingness to trust the people, to create a framework where we liberalized and allowed people to utilize their creativity and enterprise by creating the kinds of frameworks or infrastructure that freed them. The current government's vision seems to center around the term Atmanirbhar, or self-reliance. We're going to be dependent on ourselves. Sounds good. And in some ways, it is a continuation of the past I was talking about. We're going to create, for example, in the last budget, more emphasis on connecting India, on logistics, and devote more resources to it. That's good. That's part of the framework. That's part of enabling people, and that will help. But in some ways, Atmanirbhar takes us back to a more distant and failed past, before the period of reforms, when we focused primarily on physical capital and producing goods, not human capital and services, and we tried to do it through protection and subsidies, not through liberalization and competition. But one thing that certainly is worrisome is the neglect of human capital. Think, for example, of how many children have been out of school for the last 2 or 3 years. There's some kind of school that many of our poorest kids have been at, in the sense that maybe schools have been transmitting on a small mobile, but connections are weak, are haphazard. Most kids don't have access to a smartphone. How much have these kids really learned? And if you've been out of school for 2 years, It doesn't mean that you're 2 years behind, because you've also forgotten 2 years worth of school. So you're actually 3 or 4 years behind, and that's what the studies are showing. These kids are way behind. Wouldn't you think the single biggest mantra for a government should be, how do we get kids back to school? How do we not lose a generation of kids? Because remember, it's 12 years worth of kids who've all experienced no schooling. How do we get kids back to perform? Otherwise, this is going to be a huge source of inequality, stress, and underperformance in the years going forward. Chinese growth initially was achieved by suppressing wages and consumption, focusing on exports, and enabling industries by providing them cheap capital, by also underpaying households for their savings. Deposit rates were kept really low, cheap capital flowed through the banking system to corporations, and wages were kept low so that these corporations made a significant amount of money. That enabled them to grow. As they grew, wages increased. The question is, can India do this? China could keep wages low because in some ways in many ways it's an authoritarian government. And it could also suppress deposit rates because there was no competition. It was the state-owned banking system which determined much, and they were told what they could pay. We're a democracy. We've got unions. It's going to be, and we've got a population that complains. So it's going to be very hard to suppress wages. It's going to be very hard to tell depositors we're going to underpay you because it's important for industry. And so given these constraints, if you want to go on a manufacturing-led growth path, what do? Well, the government basically has been trying to do this partly by improving logistics. That's what I said earlier, and that's a good thing. But also through higher tariffs and production subsidies for manufacturers. Resistance to export-led growth in manufacturing is building across the world. We're seeing a lot of talk about inshoring, reshoring in the industrial world. Why is it that they're doing that? One is for strategic reasons. But the other is many countries are resistant to importing large amounts of goods because of the fact that they've seen it's deindustrialized them. And so, the tariffs on Chinese imports into the US, but you can expect if India was successful in creating an export-led growth strategy in manufacturing, we'd see some of those political problems. In other words, just as China is becoming much more aware of the problems with export-led manufacturing, we're jumping in, feet first into this. And is that a good strategy, even if it works? And of course, I've said there are many questions about whether it will work. So what's the alternative? And that's what I want to end with. There is a alternative path building on India's vision of increasing openness and liberalization, and this is focusing on their minds, on Indian minds and capabilities and creativity, but also on its liberal democracy. And here I'm talking about catering to demand in the much larger global market, but not goods demand. I'm talking about catering to service demand, which already India exports a fair amount. People don't know how much India exports in services, but it's where we have a net surplus, which helps us run large deficits in goods manufacturing. But I'm saying, let's not move to putting enormous amounts of resources in fostering manufacturing as in the PLI scheme. Now, it's approaching 50,000 crores a year and could increase significantly. Let's think about increasing the other side. What will it take to increase service exports from India? What do we need to do there? And if we need to choose between putting $1 of government money here or $1 of government money there, let's think about where it is more appropriate to put that money. So now, I think the environment for service exports has changed substantially during the pandemic. The pandemic has made it easy to offer high value added services that are distant. And a final reason for a focus on services, if we are going to put our eggs in some strategic basket, is that the world has to grow green. It is unfortunately, the only way forward. And consumption of goods cannot grow at the pace at which it has grown in the past, even if poor countries become richer. More of the consumption basket will increasingly consist of services, including creative services, even for moderate income countries. So if we were to pick sectors of the future, are we going to pick manufacturing, which is increasingly harder and more backward looking, or are we going to pick services, which is increasingly the future? My guess is services would make sense. India has a lot it can do in services, but relying on its past of democratic liberal openness. And if we do that, we can be the first country that transitions directly from agriculture to services without going through manufacturing. So in that case, the premature deindustrialization that Professor Danny Roderick worries about is not a bug for India, it's a feature of the Indian process. Now, last point. We're not going to get there without work. India has deficiencies. Let's be realistic about it. We have a lot of students in universities, we have a lot of students in schools, but as we just talked about earlier, our schooling has big problems even without the pandemic, but with the pandemic, additional problems. And our higher education is not up to the mark in many cases. We need to upgrade in a significant way. So that's job one, increase capabilities. Second, we need a government, because we're going through a more difficult, different path, we need a government that is more pragmatic, transparent, decentralized, and open to challenge. In other words, we need a learning government, a government that sees what's happening, hears it, and adjusts accordingly. Not a government that says, I know, here it is, take it or leave it. And third, we need a world order that is more hospitable to trade in services. So it's not going to happen automatically. There are huge vested interests in services. So India has to, start being part of the process of opening up. I am arguing that because there's a lot more services being performed by industrial countries, it may be a lot easier than perhaps resisting the protectionism that is building up in manufacturing. First point is to give everybody a fair chance. If you want talent, you have to draw from everywhere, including our largest minority, women, but also religious minorities like Muslims and our disadvantaged castes and tribes. So we have to have a society that treats everybody equal. I say this not just because of the economic benefits. A discriminatory society is not just immoral, it is also weak. It is weak because it is internally divided. No minority treated as second-class citizens would stay docile in the face of the oppressive behavior of the majority. That is a fact of history. We just need to look to our neighbor to the south, Sri Lanka, and see what happens when you mistreat a large minority. And so we should know that division offers a handle for outsiders to intervene. We don't want to be divided. This is a time for uniting, and uniting on the basis of equality is the only way to go. Second, people, even the very poor, know what is best for them. So trying to empower people to seek better futures for them, for their children, is part of this process of change. Just don't think it's going to be top down. Allow it to be bottom up. And allowing it to be bottom up means, for example, putting cash in their hands, direct transfers, that they can buy what they want. And what often it will be is not drink, as some people argue. These guys are going to blow it away. Instead, it's going to be better education for their kids. And they're going to be part of that process. And once they're paying for it, they also have more ability to influence the quality because they actually have the money and they're not getting a freebie from top down. This also means that government has to be more responsive. And one way to make government more responsive is to decentralize functions, funds, and functionaries, not just from the center to the state, but from the state to the local government, to the panchayat. And lastly, we need much more weight on individual rights and freedoms so that people can be critical. A lot of the acts like the UAPA or the sedition law is used, they're used to stamp down on criticism. Somebody who criticizes is a Naxalite. They are unhappy and against the state, and we're going to put them away. That suppresses criticism, often used by lazy government officials to essentially protect their turf. We need to remove these acts and work far better in not using the crutch of these draconian acts in order to provide a good security environment. We can do better than what colonial governments did in the past. Second point, learning government. So first, increase people's capabilities by empowering them, getting them to do more. Second, learning government. In this kind of environment, government has to experiment. First at a small scale, then roll out more widely, rather than imposing it from on top at a wide scale without any evidence that anything that they impose will work. So in other words, I would have started the PLI scheme small, see that it works, then roll it out, instead of before I know its success, roll it out everywhere. Similarly, Agnipath, I would have done it small and then rolled it out more widely once I know it actually works. That kind of experimentation also needs criticism. If I don't have criticism, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. If I actively suppress criticism, every press report that is critical, I call the editor up and say, why did you publish it? In that case, I'm never going to learn, because I'm only going to learn when people come out on the streets to protest. That's going to be my learning. That's not a particularly good way to learn. In fact, I suppress the most important way of learning, which is learning from statistics. I don't know what the death rate from COVID was in India. The studies say it could be anywhere between 4 to 6 million. The government says it was 500,000. There's a huge gap between these numbers. And of course, because the studies are done by independent sources, we tend to believe them more. Can't we improve the quality of our statistics? To conclude, we need an Indian path. I mean, the Chinese path will not work for us. We need an Indian path that draws on the capabilities of all Indians and builds on India's historic culture of tolerance and respect. It builds on India's liberalism, not just the fact we have regular elections. That's not the entirety of liberalism. It's the fact that we can argue and debate and criticize. We can have ideas that are diametrically opposite to that of the government. That will actually improve the quality of Indian governance, because criticism makes us better. It will also make India more trusted by citizens elsewhere. So we can become a Vishwa Guru. The word Vishwa Guru is much used by the current government, but not based on the ideas of the past only, but really on a model of development for the future, which is green, which is inclusive, which is local-led, and which persuades the world by showing that it actually works. We need to make it work. It's not going to be easy given current trends, but we can all work to make it happen. Let me stop there. Thank you.